Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're here talking chapter 11. Looks like we get to talk about the South today. So 1800 to 1860. So let's see what our textbook friend has to say.
Beginning in the early 19th century, the most important development in the southern region of the nation was the explosive production of cotton. Cotton became extraordinarily profitable for southern planters, and as a result, they not only sought to buy more land and grow more cotton, but they also sought to acquire more slaves in order to produce that cotton. Earlier in the century, President Jefferson had outlawed what was called the African slave trade, which meant that Africans could no longer be imported to the United States to work as slaves. What that meant in practice was that the slave population in the South immediately became more valuable as the flow of enslaved Africans was shut off. And so there developed an internal trade in slaves, where, for example, in Virginia, where they developed a surplus in the number of African Americans, they would sell them to go work in the new cotton states of Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. Over 1 million slaves were transported from the East Coast states to the Old Southwest as a result of that internal slave trade. So cotton directly influenced the rise of what was called the slave kingdom in the South before the Civil War, and very much influenced the political, social, and economic dynamics of that distinctive region.
Alrighty. So cotton. So cotton was technically the latecomer to the New World agriculture. We kind of started with tobacco, and that kind of had the run of plantations in the South. But environmentally, it was very harmful to grow consistently as it leached the land of nutrients. So you would grow it, it would kill the land, and you'd have to move it, and all kinds of problems. So in order to retain the viability of their land, farmers would look for other crops to plant in addition to tobacco, such as rice, indigo, and sugar, as well as cotton. So although the South during this era usually is considered a unified region, it was actually composed of three distinctly different regions. So you have the lower South, which is made up of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. These states were renowned for their labor-intensive cotton plantations. The second group comprises of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. This is the Middle South. They grew diversified crops and were not reliant on cotton as their only export. And then the final group is going to be the Upper South, which included Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And this is a region where slavery had already begun to decline. So as to the 19th century wore on, concerns of Southerners turned to diversifying the economy away from planting to save the soil. Not the slaves, the soil. They also believed that they were too reliant on the North to manufacture and ship their products. The development of manufacturers would soon commence, but there would not be enough support for the endeavor to allow manufacturing to catch up to the North. So they did try manufacturing down in the South. It was a little bit done, but they just couldn't match what was going on up north. This is going to be cotton production in 1821. And you can see the concentration right here, Georgia, South Carolina, up into Tennessee, and then Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. So that lower South part. So each dot represents 1,000 bales of cotton. So quite a... Thanks, Eli Whitney, in the cotton gin. So 1821 to 1869, you can see it's increased. So this previous map was going to be in 1821. By 1859, prior to the Civil War breaking out, I mean, it is massive amounts. This is how they're making a majority of their money. Okay. So these are bales of cotton right down here. This offers a glimpse of staggering scale of cotton production. Those 500-pound cotton bales are so densely packed and plentiful that men are walking upon them. And this is in Galveston, Texas. So they're walking on the cotton. That is how secure it was. All right. So ever since the southern states were originally founded as colonies, they had relied on their agrarian roots to provide their income. When the United States won its independence, the South chose to continue on with their relations with Great Britain, which by the 1850s was the chief purchasers of its cotton. So this is why we have a problem with the tariffs that Andrew Jackson imposes. Well, 1828 and 1834, I think. Anyway, that's why we have a problem with the tariffs, because they are still have a lot of business going on between them and Great Britain. So in Southern society, a planter was a man who owned at least 20 slaves. Prior to the Civil War, planters made up 4% of the Southern society. The wife of a planter was charged with the domestic sphere of the plantation. She took care of the household. The men took care of the outdoors. The most numerous members of the white society in the South were the middle class. Generally small farmers who are usually mobile and willing to go where jobs and land were available. Very few of them had slaves. And we certainly don't have the same amount of middle class that we have up north, where there's factories and all that kind of stuff. This is Mary Chestnut. She wrote her diary describing the Civil War. It was republished in 1981, and it actually won the Pulitzer Prize. Imagine just writing your diary and you win the Pulitzer Prize just for putting your thoughts on paper. Let's see. The final class of white Southerners were those known as poor whites. They were usually landless people who hunted or foraged for their survival. One of the final cultural imports from England to be cast off was the class and honor systems of the mother country. Until that time, these dual cultures ruled the lifestyles of all Southerners and limited their social acquaintances and lifestyle mobility. Honor and violence. All right. The smallest number of African Americans in the South were the freedmen. These are individuals who had either never been slaves or had purchased their freedom from their masters. Only 10% of the entire African population in 1860 were freedmen. The importance of slaves into the United States, the importation, I can't even read today. The importation of slaves was into the United States was abolished in 1808. Remember, that was a constitutional thing. However, slaves continue to be traded and imported by smugglers in areas where enforcement was difficult. And actually, that kind of enforcement is probably difficult in more places than you can think of. As slaves were costly to purchase and required care, the majority of all slaves in the South resided on plantations. They were usually divided into two categories. You have your household slaves and your field slaves. The household slaves were usually skilled and treated better than the field hands, who were forced to work long hours outdoors. Those slaves who lived in the cities experienced greater interactions with their masters and others in the area. Typically, the most visible of these served as street vendors or making handicrafts. So, still slaves. All right. Once importation of slaves was abolished, the value of slave women soared. Because how do you keep your slave population up? You birth more babies. Women were encouraged to become pregnant by rewarding them with less work and more food. But once the child was born, the women were often required to carry their child with them when they returned to their work. Yeah. This is a badge issued in Charleston, South Carolina. It was worn by a free black so that he would not be mistaken for someone's property. So they had to label themselves. Yeah. Slave population in 1820. You can see the concentration mostly in these coastal areas and kind of spreading out, definitely mainly in the South. All right. Now we start getting laws. These are all free states. These are slave states. You can see clearly lined definition. All right. This is Jack. This is a portrait taken in 1850. It's a daguerreotype, which is a type of photograph. The man is only identified as Jack. He's a driver from Guinea on the plantation of B.F. Taylor of Columbia, South Carolina. And I don't know if you can see the scars and whatnot on his face. And if you look closely, there's scars on his back too. So likely he's been beaten numerous times. All right. The slave Celia was a teenage girl who was made her owner's mistress. Eventually, she kills him in self-defense. She is not allowed by law to testify at her trial. So if you remember when we watched 12 Years a Slave, the end part, it basically says that black people don't have a say in trials. She was found guilty and executed because she can't speak for herself. Slave marriages were not recognized by states, as a slave could be sold at any moment, regardless of relationship status. Childhood for most slaves ended at 5, when they were expected to begin helping out on the land. As black families were subject to owners' whims and could be sold separately or together, slaves tended to form communities based not on blood, but on the common experiences shared by their members. Research has shown that many of these elements are still in existence among African Americans today. In a society in which they were not allowed free will, slaves were drawn to the promise of a better world awaiting them that Christianity provided. Unwilling to accept what many white pastors preached to them, slaves would often turn to a slave preacher in what were known as bush meetings. This is just cotton. You mentioned a cotton gin, since production soaring, deepening the South's dependence on slavery. Go Eli Whitney. This is the slaves of Mississippi Governor Tillman Tucker. They gather in the woods to bury and mourn one of their own. Can you imagine you have to go to the woods to bury your dead? Alright. As far as rebellions go, they're quite rare. They were usually met with overwhelming force and the conspirators were killed. The most famous was Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, in which he and his friends killed over 50 whites, by I think it was 55, before the rebellion was put down. Nat Turner and his supporters there were hung. And what this does is actually increase or decrease their freedoms. So slave laws become a lot more strict, such as you can't teach a slave to read, for instance. That becomes against the law. This is a published account of Turner's rebellion. It's written by Turner's lawyer, Thomas Gray. Great. So the South. So although it's composed of distinct regions, the South stood as one when it came to the issue of slavery. As movements to free the slaves began to appear, the regions of the South become more in lockstep in preventing emancipation from occurring. As you can see, we are getting closer and closer to the Civil War. Not a lot to say in this chapter, apparently. Hey, that's the shortest one ever. You're welcome. Alright, well, I hope you all have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, and I will see you soon. Bye.